in our last workshop, I'm just doing a very quick recap. Basically, we introduce what qualitative approach and quantitative approach basically looks like, and just do a very general overview of the process. And so here, today we're going to share, it will be more like a conversation style today, because both of me and Zhang Chong, we are pretty seniors, like we are in our candidacy is almost like, and so basically we're going to, based on our experience and based on our conversation with faculty members, to share some of the practical ways how you could form a better and feasible research question, and that is a really good start of your research project. So basically, again, we will start with this step. Like generally, we will start with exploring your research interest, and then later we will introduce a couple of ways and resources how you could narrow down your focus, and then qualitatively and quantitatively, how do we usually frame or forms our research question. And of course, there are some practical consideration that if you have never conducted any research before, you may not expect those. But here we want to provide you some of the heads up, so you could pay attention to that.
And by the way, because for today's workshop, it is kind of sharing experience through our conversation. So me and Pei-Rong, we will talk about our own experience from qualitative perspective and quantitative perspective, but also like in the real research, very often you're going to use somewhere both sides. So we kind of talk about how we from our concentration, from our major of concentration, how we proceed, how we identify our research topic. For example, define what research we want to do for our dissertation. And also because it's kind of casual conversation, sharing experience. At any point you have any questions, just feel free to turn on your mic and jump in, because methods is just a tool to achieve your own goals. But people come from various backgrounds. You're doing research from various, cover a broad scope of topics. But regardless of the context, there are very particular considerations of using particular approach to help you answer your research question. So you're welcome to jump in, asking question, or share with us, for example, oh, this is my field of study. How should I kind of utilizing or apply these considerations into my very specific scenario? Okay. Okay.
All righty.
Okay.
So, yep, sure. I'll go ahead and start here. So usually the first step when you enter into your graduate study that you will, a lot of people, or generally we will always start with course taking. And some of you, if you are working in a lab, if you have a mentor, if you have an advisor who has a larger project, they may invite you to their project too. And so when you engage in your major, in your field, or through course taking and through reading the articles that relates to your field or either your course, this is usually the initial step where you're starting to identify or feel your research interest. Here I could say feel is because it's really broad. So for example, I actually spent about 1 to 1.5 years really to immerse in my field, that is methodology, and then to get a sense of like what methodologies mean. But at the same time, I was also exploring my substantiated research interest, which eventually coming up with working with international students. So at this stage, it could be so bored that I could say, well, okay, so now I could say my research interest relates to international students and the methodology co-consideration working with them. So at this stage, don't worry about, okay, but what if I don't have a very specific or concrete description of research question? That's totally fine, because we will come up with like multiple phases and the resources and steps and ways to kind of narrow them down. So that was my experience. How about you, Zhang Chong?
Yeah, I think back in my, back to my like first and second year in my program, every time when I meet with my advisor, I told her, I said, I don't know what research question I have. I have no idea. I don't know how people come with a question. I was like, there's so much I don't know that I couldn't even raise a question asking for anything, right? But the thing is, for example, right now, the dissertation topic that the dissertation that I'm going to write is a project from my early inquiry research project. Actually, it's an extension. But back to the time when I'm doing my early inquiry, I've never think about I'm going to, continue doing that for my dissertation. So the idea is that you're going to run like finalize your thoughts step by step. You may or may not have a very good idea at the very beginning. That's okay. But if you do have a strong preference or you know that, oh, this is definitely I want to study, or this is definitely I need to study to complete my program, then you need to read literature review or read any of the relevant study that has been conducted conducted about this topic before. See what other people has been found, what are the people has been studied, why they're choosing a particular concern to research. Why it's like why they concern A rather than B. If you're thinking anything about B, you know, it's like, why not other people not even think about this? Sometimes the idea can be refined by reading other people's work. Well, most of the time, actually. So literature review, it's a very good way to either refine your topic or just give you some, inspiration.
Yes, thank you for emphasizing that, because that was definitely one of the points when we had a conversation with some of the faculty members, and they kind of share these point where they appreciate we also mentioned this, because in my past experience and also working with many students, like a lot of people just hate literature review because it's reading and tons of reading, and you don't know whether or not they're eventually going to your paper, but that was the process, that exactly the correct process to help you to narrow down the research focus, which next slide here, Zhang, please, thank you. That these are including these ways that these are the ways that helps you to narrow down your exactly focus. And so first of all, your field is mostly here. I mean, either your major or later on you will probably have a minor. And so what I mean here is that what has been done with your what has been done with your research interest in the field so far. So again, that connects to the literature review, and by reading things in the field and from the previous studies that you may probably have found, okay, these are maybe the gaps, and these may have been done, and these may have been done, but can be improved, so on and so forth. And what have been advocated to be done by the field. So for example, in education, in the field of education, AERA is one of the biggest conference. And so they will always, if you go to their the annual meetings website, they will always say, okay, for this year, this is our focus. So it more or less kind of speaks to, for example, recently, more and more conferences started to focus on equality and diversity. These may be the trend of the field. And so maybe it could help you to also narrow down and, guide your way to, for example, if I'm thinking about international student, then exactly what is the, the focus that I could be, I could focus on when I'm working with them. And so maybe, look at the announcement or read the announcement from the major conference in your field. And the theory and the research approach, that is also another I would say aspect. So instead of like thinking from the substantiate, quote unquote, substantiate area of the field, that for example, international student, maybe some people is being drawn by a specific theory. So for example, some people would say in learning sciences, there's activity theories. Some people is really being drawn by these ideas, and they just want to see, okay, how these theory could be applied in the field or in, in the real classroom. And so, so does, the methodologies. There will be participatory action theories, not theory, but research approach, where you actually don't know your research question until you really goes into the field and when you work with your participant. And so these could be drawn actually and developed through your serious theory or the research approach that you decided to choose. And it doesn't really need to come from the empirical approach. And again, there's a chance, like if you are studying a PhD in IU, that you're, mostly request to choose a minor. So from choosing a minor, it kind of with more chance to take courses other than your major. And that is also a very good opportunity for you kind of to explore, other area. And what I means with existing project, independent project here, it's at the beginning, I mentioned that maybe some of you may have been working with some of the faculty members or your advisor. They may have projects. So if the project is really big, if the project has already been done for 2 years or 3 years, there are a bunch of data already, or they're going to collect data in the maybe next year. And your advisor say, well, you could use it as your dissertation data. Then it's also very good that you already have rich resources. But what you need to do is, I would suggest to look at the general goal of this project and who are the participants and what are the resources and why these projects is designed like this and what is the next step of these projects. So everything is basically project-based if you are using the resources of your lab or advisors. But on the other hand, if it's independent project, then you could think about if these independent or individual project, which is the project that basically fully developed by yourself, you could think about if this is just a side project that you just want to work on it for half a year or just for coursework, or do you want to treat it as your early inquiry project that may take about 1 to 2 years, or do you want it to be a dissertation? Then how much time do you want to spend on these? Because thinking about these things will actually helps you to decide the size of the project, and it helps you to kind of, plan ahead. If you are, for example, it's just a side project, then maybe you just want to collect a couple of surveys instead of like interviewing 30 people, let's say, which ended up with 50 hours of data that eventually could turn into a dissertation project. So that is something you could think about. And also individuals who can help that think about like who are the mentors, what are their expertise, and what is the major research approach that has been used in your current field or program, because some of your programs may use more quantitative than qualitative, where some of your program or field may use more qualitative otherwise. So look at the people around you, because eventually they will be ended up with your being your committee members. So you definitely want to make sure there's somebody that can really be there and support you. You don't want to choose a methodology or topic that ended up like, oh, okay, my advisor cannot help. There's nobody can help. Then basically I'm isolated. That it's not a situation you want to be. So there are also, of course, other considerations. So for example, if you're thinking about graduation, that after you graduate, what kind of jobs or works you want to do. If you're ended up with like in the industry, then maybe you want to do something related to that, more practical, a project that could demonstrate your skills. But if you want to stay in academia, then maybe you want to really work on something that tied to your research interests. So those are also other considerations.
Okay, yeah, I just want to add something I just thought about. So some of the very practical concern, especially just come with the real world. For example, because we have several guests here, I don't know which school you're from. I don't know your research background, so I'm just bring some general example. Regardless of your field of the field of your own study, if you just browse recent research, we see a surge of research relevant to COVID-19. COVID's impact can be impact to the society, to the social equality, impact to business, to manufacture, or to public health, of course, and to education, because school are going to deliver more online education. And the impacts of, for example, employee payment because they need to work remotely. That's something we cannot expect before COVID coming, right? This is something just happened, right, in the real world. Another thing is we see right now it's a growing research focus on using big data, just because with the internet and the growing use of internet, there are tons of data merged in almost all the fields. So people are kind of, if there is a field, they do not really rely on the internet-based data before. Right now, they definitely have more than before. So this is some very practical consideration you can experience or observe by yourself on your own. And this relates to, as we mentioned before, the literature review. Because for example, if you are from public health and you're also interested in study some of the, how to say that, like similar disease to COVID-19, which is transmissible among human beings, then the literature review of COVID-19 will be, in terms of the amount, will be very recent, but not very much in terms of the total amount. But all the studies can be very new and very recent just because it's kind of a new occurrence, right? So this is some of the things you can think about when you collect, finding those previous published paper relevant to your research project. In addition to your major, your minor project with your colleagues, your advisors, some of your own interest, together with what happened in our real world. Okay.
So here we want to pause a little bit, see if any questions at this stage.
Yes.
Yes, Swoop.
I have a question. Thank you for sharing great tips. And I really want to go deep about the literature review. So do you guys also like check on dissertation particularly? Because like I got a feedback on my research question saying that this research method, this question is more like you using discourse analysis, while I thought of bringing narrative analysis, narrative inquiry. So my advisor got the cue, got a sense that I'm not designing the research question in line with the methodology. But when I kind of reviewed the articles, like it's very short, so we cannot really get like explicit statements of the problems, or like RQs are not really explicated. So I actually go back to see it like dissertations. So do you also use that strategies, like the different, can I say, subgenres of academic work or so when you do literature review? Yeah. Yeah, that's actually, I do that to see how they develop their research questions. Yeah.
Yes, that definitely is one of the difficulties, I would say. And so I think one of the resources that my advisor also provided me, and a lot of people actually don't know, is to go to the librarian. And they are really, really good at helping with identifying the literature review. And so, for example, in your case, maybe you have, for example, a substantiate field, but you are asking a question that could either be explored by discursive analysis or narrative analysis. And I guess it depends because a lot of time, actually, that is the things we are also going to cover later, that data-driven versus question-driven. So in the process, a lot of people would think, well, these should be linear because that is a lot of like textbooks told us, right? Like you have your research question, and then these are the set of the methods and methodology and data you collected, and you are going to use this to answer your question. But based on your methods or methodological consideration, actually, it's a better, and also in reality, the best practice to also refine your research questions across the way. And so maybe when you go into the field and then you're working with your participant, you may broad with these A question. So for example, I say, I want to understand international students' challenges, but realizing actually it's not just about challenge. They are applying some ways to kind of settle them down, set themselves down here and try to reach out to the resources. And so ended up like, okay, maybe I want to understand more about their support systems here, just outside than just understanding or reporting their challenges, right? And so it's actually not uncommon to revise your research question here, one, based on your participants, what you found, and B, also based on when you go into the field and when you start to work on the things and you realize, originally I want to use discourse analysis, which is really, detailed. You really look into how the language function, but ended up like, oh, I'm more interested in how their previous stories and important critical events construct their lives. And so you ended up want to understand the picture, the larger picture here. And so you could always adjust your research question based on, the things, and, eventually end up with like what kind of a methodological approach you're going to use.
So you can say like, we can, based on data, like we can come up with refine, of course, like research question, but that means you can also like revise methodology as well. That's what you're saying. Okay.
Definitely,
yeah.
Definitely.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Any other questions? Soyeon, Daryl? Okay, then we will proceed to next.
So we have probably mentioned this, like while I'm answering Suok's your question, but again, I want to give more of the details here. So for example, like how to form a research question, the rule of thumb is as precise as possible. So earlier when I say, for example, I'm interested in international students, and that is considered very broad. So what precise means here is, okay, international student at which level? Maybe in higher education, maybe in their first year, maybe graduate student, maybe doctoral student, or even candidacy. And international student with what? Maybe their mental health issues, maybe their challenge, maybe their English or language issues, or so on and so forth. So you have a multiple quote unquote variable, like quantitative use, be used like a variable to add in to make your questions as precise as possible, but also feasible. Because when you say you're going to understand international students' life, that is too broad that it is nearly non-feasible within a few years. So if you narrow it down, it kind of makes it also feasible for you to conduct it, within 1 or 2 years for it to be your dissertation project. And here, even though we have a rule of thumbs, but actually there are conceptual differences between qualitative and quantitative data. And so if you have taken some of the introductory courses before, you may probably know qualitative research is more exploratory. That means we are not ready, or not say ready, but we are not set to find out there's something that is exactly or 100% would be like this. So we are prepared to face the anticipated things in the field and to explore the things that could actually, it's a more like a bottom-up approach, I would say. And so for that, we ask a lot of how and what question to understand what the phenomena may look like in general. And so, for example, I may ask, what does international doctoral students' first year looks like in the United States? Or what are their challenges they encountered? And also, for example, how do they navigate through their first year? And what are the resources they go to, and what are the things that is lacking in their support system? And here, I want to briefly mention, not every question you have is a question you can study, quote unquote. For example, it may be a question that has been done for so long. There are already piles of literature on it already. So that's why reading literature is really important. Again, it's also from conversation with some faculty member where they say they share some of the students when doing their coursework, they will bring in a research question that has been obviously asked by 1,000 of people already, but they still think, well, but I still want to work on this. Why not? It's not say why, it's not say you cannot work on that, but also thinking about the how much contribution you could build to your field by asking that kind of question, and also of course ethical consideration. So we will also continue exploring or introducing these ideas in the next part, but I just want to throw it out here that not every question worth study. And yes.
Yeah, so from quantitative parts, I would say, because for me, myself, my research concentration will be purely methodological, meaning I'm studying like based on models, taking out any of the context. So here, what I'm talking about is kind of empirical study, but using quantitative approach. Especially in social science, some of the example is I learned from a previous consultation meeting with graduate students. So quantitative research, mostly you're going to analyze data, you're going to work with some numbers, but ultimately what you're really concerned is to finding or to confirm, is there any explanation of a particular scenario or occurrence, right? So, and think about before that is you probably already have observed something that happened repeatedly. And then we want to understand the underlying mechanism of this occurrence. We want to give some explanation based on solid evidence from our data. So it can be, this explanation can be empirically based on empirical observation or experience. That's very direct. And also it is explained, and maybe already has been before, people developed a ton of theories to explain something. For example, very often about children's mental health growing, there is a lot of theory. They have these structures explain how younger children, they have been, their cognitive awareness have been changing in certain ways, being affected by certain factors, and can be measured in so many different ways. But those are theories. And based on the theory, you may observe something very similar or different. And you collect the data. And then you want to use the data to confirm whether the theory or your observation makes sense. Why does it make sense? In what particular manner it makes sense? And also, very important is, do you have any specific concerns? For example, I just, I've met some of the students come in, talk about their research interest or some research project that they have been already working with. For example, they say, okay, I'm working with people like from a sport management. They're studying a group of participants in physical mobility. And then the specific concern will be either applying a particular training program or using some very specific supplement. And for example, in the education field, there is a lot of concern about gender difference, ethnicity difference, or sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status. Those are specific concerns. And those are the key thing in context with your research question, but you want to specifically explain, use your data. And something you want to think is how you're going to reflect this particular concern in your data. This is very important because you can explain or you can express this concern by word or by sentence. But at the end of the day, if you're using quantitative method, it has to be reflected in numbers. How does that happen? In a valid way, okay? And I think the last sentence is just missing is another thing is any practical implications. People have, it's like Pei-Rong just says, not all research questions are how to say, researchable, let's say. Why it is important, why people should care about this. Why should people care about socioeconomic status, how it influences people's education achievement? Because it's important, it matters in terms of social equality, right? So the practical implication is the thing you definitely want to elaborate to your dissertation committee or your research advisor. And it in a certain way determines whether the general audience in the whole academia or just general public, why they want to read your research work, right? Because it has to have some practical value in terms of how this topic matters to people's empirical life. But slightly different from the qualitative research part is quantitative research have very limited space for exploration, but more focusing on explain something that somehow has already been noticed and needs to be addressed because it has very important practical implication. Okay, any questions? We're good? Okay, then we'll proceed to next.
Okay, so our next but not least, again, we have put in the title to think about, you are strongly encouraged to consider the following. Not all questions needs to be answered. So these are a couple of things and questions that we encourage you to think before and also throughout your research. So for example, question-driven or versus data-driven. I think there is always a misconception that for example, oh, is qualitative always data driven or quantitative always question driven? That is not the boundary is not clear. So we will say here is actually it's matters a lot to methodology. So for example, even in qualitative, and also your field, of course. For example, in educational policy, a lot of time they may ask questions, they may conduct or carry out their data in a pretty question-driven way. Almost always they are said to say, okay, you have a clear set of data as you are going to answer and tell me how you are going to answer these questions. Versus, for example, data-driven, like for example, conversation analysis or anthropology, using these methods or in this field, it's always almost like when you, it is always like when you have your data, that when you started to look at the data, then you had a clear or better sense of, okay, what kind of question I may ask from my data here. So there's actually no right or wrong answer to these questions, like, oh, is that good or okay if I totally do my research based on a data-driven way, or do I really need to stick with like question-driven way? A lot of time is you have to know your field and also your methodology well. That is said, if you are saying, okay, but I'm using these methodology or methods that works better with a data-driven way, but I'm going for a question-driven, that I ask the question first and I stick with this question and not going to revise my question, that may not be that appropriate. So I think that is the only timing when you have to reconsider, okay, may I shift the flow of my research conduct. But also, I think there are also some ethical consideration that I think for Junction, you may have an example here that the data-driven.
Yeah. So especially, I mean, if you're using quantitative approach, data-driven and question-driven can be important because it somehow directly impact the scope of your study. For example, you can't just have a question, but you do not have a perfect data that's kind of matching precisely to the frame of your question. Then in that way, you're question driven, but then you have to collect your own data. This will involve, do you want to do an experimental design? How you want to design experiments? How, if you want to do survey collecting, then you need to design a survey. How you determine the survey is good or the experiment is good? It meets the purpose of your research question. Then meaning if you say, I'm definitely going to stay with my question with no change, then you need to be very careful to design and collect your own data. And the very tricky thing is very often it can be very difficult to have a large enough sample. That's very common in collecting self-data, right? But think about the quantitative approach. We always say a large sample is better, is preferred. But then you say, okay, then I want to collect my own data. How can I make sure I have a large enough sample? That's very hard. This is something you want to consider. Or you say, okay, let me just work with the data that I can get. I can come to some open source database, some of the previous published data. Let's see what kind of research question I can study using some third-party data. That is kind of, by looking at the data, you need to refine or reorganize your research question because the data cannot answer everything. it has to be within the scope of the data, within the accuracy level of the data. In that way, it's kind of your research question is derived based on what data you have in hand. In this way, you may have like good data, large enough sample, and you have some already well-designed variables or measures. But then the flexibility of defining your own question will be limited because you have to design or develop your research question considering what exactly the data is about, meaning you have to understand this data very well. And another thing is for example, the point 4, what data do you need to collect for your research question? This statement is kind of saying, okay, when you have a research question, you're going to collect your own data. That is somehow start from a question driven. But at some point, you may realize it's very it will cost so high to collect the ideal data, the perfect data that you definitely want. From there, you need to revise your research question or to make it practical. That will go to the 5th consideration, is this feasible? So everything is kind of related to each other and confined with each other. We may have a very good idea, but it is just too good to be carried out.
Yes, thank you so much for the elaborations, Zhang Chong. So I think Zhang Chong already kind of touched on some of the points down here, but I will just quickly go through. But again, they are all related, and they will all occur throughout the process when you are carrying out a study, because you may again for the question too is why do you decide to work on this topic and what's your motivation and contribution. These may appear at the beginning when you start to write your introduction, when you start to initiate your project, but also will appears at your writing stage, because you have to prove to your readers, this is very important. I need to do this project. This is the reason why. And so it will keep recurring. And the 3rd and the 4th question relates a little bit to the ethical consideration. So if you are working with human subject, regardless of qualitative or quantitatively, for quantitatively, you may send out some questionnaire either online, either in person, or you have like experimental design that you may carry out, which is more in the hard science field, but like they may conduct some of the experiments and have contact with human subjects. Well, it's very, very common in qualitatively that 90% of time, except if you are doing just a systematic literature review or working on the archival data, that is another kind of project, but 90% of the time you will be working with human subjects. So think about who will be involved in the process and also who will benefit from it. Because a lot of time people are questioning that, does it really worth it when you do this project and compared to the potential harm you may cause to your participant. So for example, a lot of people may rush to for example, India or East Asia or some of the countries to work with the refugees or the victims from the sexual arousement events. And a lot of people want to do this kind of study and report their stories. But also we need to consider how much of the value is coming from this kind of study versus how much of potential harm you may cause to, for example, those survivors and your participants. Will you re-traumatize them by asking the questions or doing your study? So these are the question we encourage you to think about before you initiate your study, and definitely talk with your mentor or committee member. They know about this. And again, what are the data you need to collect from for your research question? If you need to interview people, if you need to send out survey, and is it feasible that in regards to, like Zhang Chong earlier said, that the data, yes, and if whether or not you can collect those data versus, you know, like how many times you have. For example, if you expect this to be a dissertation, that you may probably spend 2-3 years on it. But if it's just a side project, then you will probably only spend like half a year on it. So you don't want to make it a large scale study. And so that is also another consideration regarding the feasibility of the, you know, the project itself. And again, the last one is your project involve direct human intervention or interaction? Then if so, this is just a reminder that you have to go through IRB, or at least check with the IRB member. I think in our resources, like the next page, we actually provide also some of the readings, resources, and also previously I have made a YouTube video that talk about specifically the IU-IRB system. So if you need to go through IRB, you could consider watching that to get some hints of like what are the things you might need to go through. But qualitatively, you are encouraged to read these 2009 piece to develop a qualitative research question, and quantitatively you have these options that helps you to identify your research questions and that dilemma you may face. And also, I also encourage people to go to the Sage Research Method database that is available through our library, which basically you can find out tons of methodological resources and reference there. And in terms of qualitatively and quantitatively, like basically everything's there. And again, the librarian, I encourage you to reach out to the librarian regarding literature review, not only literature review, but also explore what are the resources available across the campus. And also they helps with some of the reference management, for example, EndNote. If you try to organize everything together, you want to use software, they have some resources and tutorial there, and that can help you to work on that. Yeah. Anything to add on?
Yeah. Any questions? Anyone want to share their own research project with us? Yeah, please.
Hi,
Hello.
I'm Sohan Yang, and I'm a first-year doctoral student.
Yay.
This is my first
Welcome.
semester, so I really have no idea about my research. So I have just my broad interest
Mhm.
of K-12 technology integration. So in based on your experience, what's your suggestion for the first semester or first year doctoral students to go forward to my research?
Mhm. Yes.
Sorry, you say your major is K-12 technology?
Actually, my major is instruction systems technology, and my interest area is K-12 technology integration.
Oh, that's good. That's a
Yes.
yeah. I think it's kind of a really attentional topic in the field. Yeah. Well, because right now you're just first year, you just start this journey, your professional academic journey. So I would say at this point, honestly, you do not need to worry too much about like doing a research on your own or by yourself. I think at this point, it will be helpful to, for example, you can talk to your advisor to say, is there any of the research group, like normally for my advisor, some of the PhD students that she is advising, they collaborate on research project. And this is like a grouping work. They meet, frequently every week maybe. And they share their ideas, share their literature review, share their thoughts how to proceed. I think when I was in my first year, I don't really actually involved in the project, but I'm just sitting there to listen like how they talk about the things. Because for now, maybe kind of you're in a very earlier stage to know what's a real research project looks like. But it's better to just see how other people doing it. Yeah, from your peers and your advisor, your cohort, that would be very helpful and a supportive resource.
Yes, I actually have very similar suggestion and also experience on that. In my first few years, I actually have changed major before, but like I remember sitting in a group like weekly in my previous program, we have weekly program meeting. Basically, every students and every faculty in the program, we will meet together, and the senior student will share their project, and then I was basically just sitting there and then learning the ways how they give each other advices and suggestions, supports and feedbacks, and also to see what kind of a project that is happening in my program right now, and then what kind of question people ask, and what could be my possible directions. And so that was at that stage for 1.5 years to 2 years. So I definitely would say you're just in your first semester here, and then, thinking it's just less than 2-3 months, you have been accomplished a lot. Like you are learning ways to, first of all, you have to get used to what's the graduate studies culture, right? And use also the United States study, the culture here, and a lot of things navigating through. So I would definitely encourage you to be patient and be gentle to yourself, and not being stressed out by seeing senior students showing a lot of amazing work, because thinking they have been staying here for 3-4 years already. So they've been immersed in the field a lot already. So just learn from them and be humble, and don't be afraid of asking questions or reaching out if you need somebody to talk. I think in the next page, if you don't mind, Zhangchun, could you switch to next page? So in our last page, if you are thinking about or is interested in doing some of your independent studies or projects, or you just need to talk through. I mean, we also offer support. Welcome to make appointment with us, and then to helps you to guide you through ways of carrying out your academic trajectory. Here I also want to make sure, actually, our next Tiny Method workshop, and will also be our last workshop for the semester, because today we have introduced the research question. So next time and next topic will be research design that helps to answer your research question. That is really important. Like earlier, we keep emphasizing, if you're asking a question that could only be answered by using interview, but you're only thinking about survey, that is totally wrong, right? And so, yeah, if you have time, that Thursday, the same time, we will be here and, working with you and just answering all your question. But also throughout these semester and also next semester, feel free to make an appointment with us. I hope I answered your question.
Sure, thank you.
You're welcome.